downstairs in the other room, so if you want to go there.
Would everyone in this room please quiet down? Thank you. All right, everyone. Hello and welcome to the semis of Vietnam World Schools Debating Championship. Congratulations to Team Malaysia and Team USA for having made it to the semis. I'm your chair for this round. My name is Shilito. I have no preferred pronouns. Joining me on the panel from that side is Ansar.
Hey everyone, I'm Ansar. Good luck.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline. All the best to both teams.
I'm Christopher William from South Africa, all the best.
Hi everyone, I'm Londo and all the best to both.
Hello, Theodore from Greece. He can please best of luck.
Hi everyone, Lucas, he, him please, best of luck to both teams.
Andrew from New Zealand, looking forward to a great day.
Hi, I'm Lucia. Please let me know best of luck.
Okay, so just a bit of housekeeping. We have our timekeeper here. She will be timing you. One bell at 1 minute. Yeah, two bells at 7, is it? No.
No,
One bell at 7 and two bells at 8 and three bells at 8:15. But please keep your own timer so that we don't, miss the mark. Having said that, without further ado, may we have the first proposition to kick off this debate here.
Malaysia, buddy!
Is it alright if I speak at this volume? Okay. Being a parent is the most rewarding thing many people can hope for. It is the desire to watch your child grow from a baby who speaks to the world semifinals, for example. Queer people are no different from that, but we think uniquely under the side of proposition where their choice to have a family is empowered, and when they're normalized in the status quo, that is a world we yearn for, we're so proud to propose. Before I forward two substantive arguments within the speech, on to set up 4 things. 1. We support the LGBTQ movement actively embracing the nuclear family ideal. What does this look like? It means that they embrace the concept that LGBTQ individuals are capable of having a nuclear family. Note that this is quite similar to what the LGBTQ movement did with the free love movement when it came to doing things like trying to co-opt marriage equality for queer individuals. B, we think the messaging the movement would then adopt is they would advocate for the legitimization of LGBTQ individuals being able to do things like have a family. So they focus on creating accessibility pathways, for example, making it far easier for queer individuals to adopt a child or have a biological one through IVF. Secondly, note that there are many iterations of what the nuclear family ideal looks like. So at this precipice in the debate, we think the LGBTQ movement would frame the ideal through the lens of queerness. For example, having the ability to have a family isn't only restricted to heterosexual individuals. But note that this doesn't mean that the community will have to advocate only for family at the expense of other things. We think they can still do it, we think they can still advocate for queer individuals having access to things like marriage. It doesn't have to be exclusively family. On our side, we would do things like focus on dismantling these stereotypes surrounding queer individuals and their ability to have a family. For example, that having a mother and father isn't necessary in order to raise a child successfully. Queer individuals can do this too. Thirdly, what is the actual comparative that opposition needs to defend in this debate? Note that, in the context of the status quo, we've already been able to secure things like marriage rights for queer individuals in many liberal democracies. But the one stereotype that we have yet to defeat in the status quo is the notion that LGBTQ individuals are incapable of having a family because they're going to corrupt our children. Note that the stance of having a nuclear family isn't one that exists in a vacuum. It is a lifestyle choice that the movement is going to prescribe onto individuals. Therefore, on the side of opposition, they also need to prescribe an alternate ideal lifestyle for LGBTQ individuals to pursue. Note then on our burden, insofar as we prove that them choosing to co-opt the nuclear family ideal is able to empower the ability of LGBTQ individuals to pursue a family and uniquely dismantles the harmful stereotypes that are imposed onto them in the status quo, that is enough to take this round. Two arguments. One, on how the adoption of a queer family model is the best form towards humanizing members of the queer community, and secondly, why we maximize the choice of members in the community to have access to things like family planning. On the first argument, 3 parts. One, note that the adoption of the family unit for many social movements has actually been an extremely strategic move, because a vast majority of the social movements in the status quo were successful largely because they chose to integrate the family unit into their models of advocacy. For example, the civil rights movement saying that all individuals regardless of race should have the ability to do things like have children, or the feminist movement choosing to co-opt the nuclear family to show that working women are able to simultaneously hold a job and raise a successful family. What this means is that every social movement to an extent in the status quo recognizes that society is built upon the family unit, and we believe that the LGBTQ movement participating in this trend is crucial towards their success. What is the conclusion of this layer? One, it shows that the concept of the nuclear family model is malleable and it's susceptible to evolution, so it isn't a stagnant one that opposition would likely try to argue to you. But secondly, past precedent shows that other movements have been largely successful when they choose to adopt this model, because what you're doing is you're trying to show the rest of society that we can be the same as you and we are not as different as you think you are. Secondly, why is this trend of co-opting the family unit actually beneficial against fighting stereotypes? Because note, the biggest stereotype that queer individuals face in the status quo is that you are incompatible with the quote-unquote normal ways of life, that you're unable to exist as a functional member of society because your sexuality is different from the rest of them. The way you combat this is by humanizing them. So how exactly does embracing the family unit humanize these individuals? 2 ways. One, we do things like spotlight the very human experiences of queer families when it comes to raising their children. For example, through shows like Modern Family, which show Mitch and Cam were able to successfully raise their adopted daughter, Lily. And the parallel once again is the free love movement, where we showed that all individuals deserve the ability to love whoever they want, and that was highly successful when it came to garnering things like marriage equality. But secondly, and more importantly, note that society's greatest respect is reserved for parents, because uniquely, parenting is something that requires large amounts of sacrifice. It's difficult, and when we show that queer individuals are able to be good parents, we think this respect is cross-applied to LGBTQ individuals, because society can empathize with them with how difficult it is when it comes to raising a child. And the way we overcome these differences is by showing that our interests are aligned. Why are we able to do this? Because now we think that the notion is that these individuals are just like me and they deserve my respect. For example, Pete Buttigieg, who's not only a politician, is also capable of being a father. I think these are the instances of humanization that we think are good. Lastly then, on impacting, what are the 2 stereotypes we dispel? One, that these individuals are not capable of being selfless, because when we show that parenting is an extremely difficult effort, it takes plenty of positive perceptions that are now attached to these individuals. And the parallel is that politicians who don't have families in the status quo are criticized as incapable because they can't even control their home. Literally every single successful politician has to have proven their capability via having a successful family. But secondly, and more importantly, we remove the gender stereotypes of maternalism and paternalism that exist in families. Because what we show now is that queer relationships can be diverse, that a family can sustain without having a maternal or paternal figure, and that both parents are capable of offering things like emotional compensation to their child. Before I go on, sure.
Modern-day feminism and other social movements reject nuclear families as it confines people to static boundaries of being the breadwinner or the caretaker. Why should the LGBTQ movement then adopt this despite the rejection by parallel social movements?
So, one, that's not true. I would argue that feminism, the only reason why we're advocating against the nuclear family unit is because it does things like say that women only have to have things like children. But uniquely on our side, the counter narrative that we are pushing is that LGBTQ individuals don't deserve the right to have a family. Uniquely, when we dispel the stereotype that they are capable human beings, that is when we actually maximize choice. Second argument on how we maximize the ability of members to have access to things like family planning. The preamble of this argument is that the purpose of the LGBTQ movement has always been to empower all choices. 3 ways. One, note that society has historically disempowered LGBTQ individuals from having a family. Not only have they faced multiple hurdles in terms of the aforementioned stereotypes in the first argument, but the greatest injustice you could impose onto these individuals is that when they cannot access their right to have a family. Why, absent of this emphasis, you won't be able to get it on their side. One, the movement isn't going to concentrate resources on creating accessibility pathways. So sure, there'll still be queer individuals who want to have children, but these are only the most wealthy who can afford the high cost of IVF. What this means is that people absent of having the movements backing them will be structurally locked out of accessing family planning. Secondly, how does the queer movement empower the choice to create families on our side? One, we advocate for paving accessibility in 2 ways. So one, when it comes to independent organizations like NGOs who provide funds to access things like IVF, adoption, and they provide consultation services. This is crucial because the barrier of entry into family planning for queer individuals specifically is very high. But secondly, we lobby governments to pass legislation that enshrines the ability to have kids. So we provide parental leave to queer parents, prevent discrimination in adoption centers, and we increase the accessibility of these individuals to experience the joys of parenthood. They would doubly punish these individuals on our side, because absent of them actively embracing this model, you don't say that all queer individuals deserve the right to have a family, and you don't empower them. No one should be stripped of the ability to have a child, and that is why we're extremely proud to propose.
For a very fine speech. Maybe now have the first mock kick off the case for desired opposition.
Hi, there is a microphone on the table. Do you want?
Can everybody hear me if I talk at this volume? Then we're good. Is everybody ready? The nuclear family is a paradigm created by, for, and because of straight people. It is diametrically opposed to diversity and liberation. It says that there is just one way a family should look, and that all people ought to choose to operate within that structure. This was never what the most diverse, broad-spanning community in the world wanted to embrace. Your queerness has no conditions. On setup, firstly, what does actively embracing the nuclear family ideal look like? The community sets this at the standard through messaging, social pressure, activism, and leadership. You, as an LGBTQ plus person, are told to aspire towards A, getting married, and B, having children as ideal. This debate then operates in 2 spheres. First, in countries where marriage and children are accessible to queer people already, like liberal democracies. In these countries, proposition would actively put down and criticize gay people who did not get married to one person and adopt or have children, the same way we might criticize single and childless people in the status quo. Second, in countries that do not have legal marriage and adoption, their side identifies this as the primary concern of the movement. This is a concern that Prime Minister completely skips over. This strategic concession will be damning for them in this speech. Secondly, our counterfactual. We would advocate for the importance of liberation and choice. In liberal democracies, we would tell the queer community that choice and exploration were good no matter what direction it took them in. The status quo already pushes that nuclear families are good, so in these places, the queer community didn't also need to do it too. However, in countries that do not have progressive pro-LGBTQ+ legislation, we would push the queer community to advocate for anti-harassment and anti-workplace discrimination laws, visibility, and acceptance. All things that are likely more pertinent concerns in the universal interests of all LGBTQ+ people. But we'll also note here that we do not have to prove positive change on our burden. We just have to prove that their side creates tangible harm. I want to begin by responding to the case that they forward to you, and the first substantive argument they talk about is humanization. The first push they tell you is, oh, having children humanizes you. The feminist movement and the civil rights movement also did this. Firstly, this is categorically untrue. The feminist movement rejects motherhood as a precondition of your acceptance in the community, and the civil rights movement never focused on this. I mean, people had children before and after the civil rights movement. But secondly, note that their argumentation here was just example level. We think that there is more likely moral panic surrounding queer people, and so we would likely see more dehumanization at the point at which you saw this type of adoption. Secondly, the second thing they tell you is about how the biggest stereotype in the status quo is that you're not a functional human being if you are a queer person. We would say then giving people that are perceived as non-functional children leads to far more backlash, and thus you would never get any of the assertions that to materialize on their side of the house. We will prove to you this in case. The third thing they tell you is, oh, you can now see queer people as capable. We would tell you homophobia is not about capability or not. It is about viewing queerness as sin, which their side only amplifies. We are going to show you the positive change in our case. The second substantive argument they tell you about is about better access. They tell you society has historically disempowered people, so their side of the house is more likely to get parental leave, IVF, etc., etc. Note, this is extremely limited within the scope of the debate because it only focuses on the most privileged stakeholders in the most privileged countries. We don't think that this deals with people who are facing far more material concerns, and we are going to prove to you that what is more important are your immediate needs as a queer person. That is going to be our case. Our first substantive argument is on decreased choice, and the thesis of this argument is why you get more coercion of LGBTQ+ people on their side. Three ideas here. One, structural alienation of subgroups within the LGBTQ movement exists on their side. Look, the queer community does not just contain gay and bisexual people, it also encompasses polyamorous people who date multiple partners and asexual and aromantic people who do not have interest in long-term relationships. Also, people who do not want nuclear families / do not see this narrative as appealing, regardless of sexual orientation, are not going to buy into the movement on their side of the house. Secondly, even for people that did buy in, you limited opportunities for exploration that were crucial to LGBTQ+ groups. Why is this the case? Because gay and trans people who are raised surrounded by heterosexual couples and heterosexual norms often do not realize their identity until later on in life. On their side, these people felt behind and excluded because they hadn't been able to immediately settle down the way that their own community, their only support system, said that they should. Thirdly, adoption and other ways of having children are very expensive. Even if it's legal, even if some NGOs step in on their side of the house, adoption is very difficult. It requires home inspections. It requires tens of thousands of dollars that are spent on the process. Further, we think the closer you get to emulating straight relationships, the more likely you are to see a need for expensive tech processes like in vitro fertilization that they tell you about. These were three groups of people who together comprised the vast majority of the LGBTQ+ community who felt shut out, invisible, dejected, and as though they were the wrong kind of queer people on side proposition's best ground. On their worst, though, in countries that never listened to queer people's calls for reform, everyone felt dejected and as though they were unable to live a fulfilling life. We think that is what disaffects them. Go.
So if you argue that the feminist movement rejects the nuclear family, it doesn't mean that they have to also reject women who choose to have children. Similarly, even if you embrace the family unit as the queer movement, it doesn't mean you need to shame queer individuals who don't opt into the model.
Listen to their own mechanisms on their side of the house. They say that this social movement and this narrative is going to be so strong and so empowering, so obviously there would be coercive pressure in order to buy into the things that they tell you about. We think this is very tense with their own case. Our second substantive argument is on protecting the aims of the movement. And the thesis of this argument is simple. The LGBTQ movement does not exist to pander to heteronormativity and straight norms. In fact, it would be tremendously harmful for the community to embrace the nuclear family. 3 ideas here. 1, on the capital trade-off between advocating for marriage rights and other rights and protections in countries without pre-existing progressive laws. Look, every dollar you pour in, every speech you give, every lawyer you hire, every event you organize for marriage rights trades off with those same things in favor of workplace protections, hate crime laws, visibility, and so on. This is according to their own warranting about the concentration of resources. There are 2 harms of this. First, on the scope of protections and what is more pressing. Marriage is not desired by all LGBTQ plus people, whereas basic economic and harassment protections are. Moreover, our protections are logically prior to marriage and adoption because the severity of harm is so much greater. Queer people need material subsistence, the right to feel safe at work, the right to not be killed as more pressing than a marriage contract. But second, more immediate rights and protections lead to marriage rights. This will flip their entire case. The best way to get a homophobe to change in their ways is for them to exist in and see the humanity of queer people in common spaces with them, which can only exist when basic workplace protections exist. Additionally, homophobic people often view marriage as sacred, thus they're further polarized away with their type of advocacy. This means more immediate rights lead to marriage rights eventually, but not the other way around. Secondly, on losing buy-in into collective actions in all countries. Very simply, we told you there were many LGBTQ plus groups and other groups of queer folks who cannot and do not want a nuclear family. Moreover, many people in the movement just don't want to have a family and children. These are huge swaths of people. You are likely to isolate and alienate them when your movement devotes significant resources towards their concept, fracturing the ability for the movement to do anything in collective action. Thirdly, on backlash, there's a unique moral panic surrounding children because society views them as particularly vulnerable. There's also a unique moral panic surrounding the sanctity of marriage within religious and conservative communities. Thus, it's safer and steadier to make sure that you can get immediate, smaller reforms because you risk danger to queer people otherwise. 3 impacts. 1, they lose access to more important material problems. 2, you lose the ability for the movement to advocate for anything. 3, you risk further danger. Queerness has no conditions. That is what we stand for.
Let's thank the group up for that very fine speech, and we can now have a second talk to extend the proposition case.
All good? A successful football player becomes an endearing cultural icon when he brings his son onto the pitch. The youngest openly gay US senator ran on a platform of family, of my husband, of my daughter, and my dog, because that is what made individuals beyond the stereotypes of their sexuality. The core of homophobia that opposition rightfully outlines is stereotypes. And the very way to get rid of those stereotypes is the humanization of these individuals through our advocacy, and that is why we propose 2 things in this speech, but before that, dealing with the context from opposition. Firstly, is this narrative going to be coercive? Because this movement and this debate is about the queer movement. So for opposition to push such a diverse, inclusive movement to now on our side of the house be forced to exclude individuals is counterintuitive. What is the parallel here? It looks like pushing for queer marriage, even though symmetrically on opposition there are polyamorous people, there are asexual people, there are people who don't believe in the institution of marriage. Because it is all about empowering choice, not about forcing individuals into the ideals of what being queer should be. It looks like the feminist movement saying you should go to work, but they don't demonize stay-at-home mothers, because the point of every social movement is to empower choice, and any advocacy broadens choice, not decreases it. What is the weighing then? Let's presume that there are structural differences between people who love children and people who don't, who are more vulnerable. On proposition, we say that the individuals who do want to have a family are the most vulnerable because the oppressive, homophobic society on opposition are discriminating against you, making sure that you can't adopt, making sure that when you bring your children to kindergarten, you have microaggressions, making sure that they never allow you to have IVF, and these are the people we protect because we're protecting them against society's structural oppression, versus if they might not like children on our side of the house, they can simply choose not to have them. But secondly, who gets to decide the definition of a nuclear family? We think it's very possible for us to define it insofar as we're making individuals humanized as opposed to relying on stereotypes on opposition. More on these in my issues, but I want to note that opposition's desire to co-opt nuclear families in first by saying if people love nuclear families so much, then the queer couples will just opt into it as well, is completely contradictory to their case. Presumably, if the queer individuals have no right to decide what queer families are, and there are going to be heteronormative norms either way, then on your side you don't allow these queer communities to opt into queer families, and if we prove that these are the most vulnerable people in this debate, then we win. Two things then in this speech. Firstly, on political advocacy. Now, what is the characterization of parallel social movements in the status quo, and how does the queer community fit into this trend? When we talk about the civil rights movement, we aren't talking about Martin Luther King, okay? We are talking about depictions of fresh off the boat Asian families like Kim's Convenience, like Raven's House, making sure that every single disparate community is represented in the most humanized way possible, because society's greatest admiration is reserved for their parents. What this humanization does more than say that they're humans, but say that they're selfless, they love individuals, they're responsible, they're capable, they have emotional intelligence to raise a child, they love, and they love beyond themselves, not selfish individuals. That is the greatest stereotypes that queer individuals have to overcome, that they refuse to carry their family's legacy, that they're living for themselves, living in their 20s forever, refusing to live in reality and for others. When we make them selfless, we make them charitable and kind, that is how you humanize individuals. The suffering, the troubles of parenting, all of them make them uniquely humanized under our side of the house. The feminist movement as well is diverse, so they can't just claim that the feminist movement is inherently anti-motherhood, because the feminist movement is probably the world's greatest social movement. The thing done on proposition is that motherhood was never a precondition to being a woman, but you were allowed to access it if you wanted to, and that is the crux of all social movements. Secondly, why is humanization of people debate winning then? Because all of their analysis on having more pressing issues is exactly dealt with when we get more resources, more critical mass, and more support. This looks like two things. One, out of sympathy. This looks like the freedom for love movement, which means that straight individuals are likely to sympathize with you by saying that society is oppressing you and depriving you of a human right. The human right for marriage and love. On our side, we extend it to the human right of having and loving a family. Secondly, when it comes to critical mass, we think the other stereotype that the queer movement has to overcome in the status quo is that they are exclusionary. Why have a queer parade, a pride parade, and not a straight pride? And that is exactly how we get rid of the stereotype of exclusion, because now there's no difference between a straight mother, a queer mother, a lesbian family. We all just want to love our children. We just want the best for our children, and through the depiction of queer individuals like this on our side of the house, we are able then to get humanization and political support. That means they will vote for your issues. That means they won't believe that you're overreacting when you're talking about like oppression. That means they believe you deserve rights, and that is how you get empowered in policy, but also in terms of, for instance, workplace discrimination. They don't believe you're inherently unhardworking, because if a queer parent and a queer father can love their son above all else, then surely all queer individuals too can share those characteristics, and we eviscerate the stereotype that they live only for themselves. But secondly, on the concept of developing communities then, opposition says that these communities preserve the sanctity of marriage, i.e. that homophobia is a sin. Yet somehow on their side of the house, they'll be able to create structures that prevent protection and etc. Surely they don't have to prove a positive comparative, but we are able to prove that the humanization of individuals gets far better. In fact, in developing countries, this probably gets even better, because for instance, the nuclear family structure is far stronger in these countries. For instance, in Malaysia, you need to have children to bring your family pride, but the only reason why they detest queer individuals then is because they can't have a family. They can't carry the family family name. But now they can. Now they have a family, now they have children, now they have a loving wife, and now the queer community is likely to get more support then. Before I go on, I'll take a point.
Proposition is running to the middle. Loving your children or showing families on TV that are gay is not your side of the house. If you want to claim you get such sweeping policy and sweeping benefits, then you need to take a hard stance instead of citing examples about showing gay couples on TV.
So we support the nuclear family, i.e. by extension supporting parenting, supporting loving your children. If you also want to defend depictions of family, if you also want to defend enshrining the queer family as being a viable option for queer individuals to take, then you are contradicting your first argument about how there are other more important things to care about. We are saying this is the most important thing because this is the prerequisite to everything else. Your case needs to engage dynamically. But secondly, on individual empowerment in two ways. One, as I've previously stated, every social movement is built upon empowerment, and even if that's not true, society itself is inherently oppressive, so any counter-narrative by social movements are required as the counter-narrative and the corrective mechanism for existing oppression. But secondly, when opposition says having children is difficult, that can't substitute for analysis. Just because you might not want biological children doesn't mean the millions of queer individuals don't. We must therefore empower the choices of these individuals, because IVF isn't the desire to be closer to a straight person, it is the desire to see your genes passed on, a biological extension of yourself for you to love and to care for and raise into a human being. And these are all points of actualization that opposition cannot co-opt, insofar as none of their resources can go towards this empowerment if they believe this is so unimportant. But lastly, we proved that we're able to empower multifaceted representations of queer individuals, insofar as historical depictions of queer individuals have been premised upon one-dimensional characterizations defined by their sexuality. Like the butch lesbian who wears flannel and sits on a motorcycle, the difference is that on their side, they are accessories to a plot and they're disconnected from the main story. When they become family members, when they're integral to the nuclear family structure, they interact with other people within the story in meaningful and interesting ways, and they're able to have dimension that opposition would never allow them to have. The American dream was premised upon actualization and autonomy, empowering all individuals to achieve whatever they wanted to. If it was a family, proposition says, so be it.
Everyone good? Awesome. Panel, the queer community is not a monolith. Diversity is not just a feature, but a core component of this community and this movement. Core to the idea of the LGBTQ plus community is that you're allowed to be sexually free. Core to their ideas is that you should not be confined by societal and heteronormative structures. What was Side Proposition's answer to that? They wanted to confine the queer community to the same heteronormative structures that they were trying to defeat for thousands and thousands of years. They destroyed the ethos of the LGBTQ plus community and prevented it from getting real change. That's why we were so proud to oppose. In this speech, two major things. First, some top-level framing, and then the two key clashes this debate has come down to. On framing, three major things. First of all, why is this narrative likely to be exclusive? And they concede this to ourselves. The only way that they get change is through a critical mass of people joining something like a nuclear family. That's the only way they access all their changes about humanization. Why does accessing a critical mass lead to why does it lead to it being exclusive? We think there's two major reasons. First of all, there's a capital trade-off. When you put tons of money toward promoting things like marriage, toward things like adoption rights, that was money that was taken away from promoting other things like preventing harassment, hate crimes, things like providing better health care to LGBTQ plus people. But second of all, the narrative of nuclear families was inherently exclusionary. The idea that you are insufficient and you are not enough of a person until you get married, until you have a child, until you settle down, necessarily meant that on their side of the house, it was exclusive. They could not run to the middle of this debate and be like, we support every single kind of romantic relationship. Second of all, they told you that the nuclear family was likely to be malleable. They don't explain to you what this means, but even if they try to explain it to you, it doesn't make any sense. The entire idea of a nuclear family is the opposition to flexibility and malleability, that everyone should follow a similar track in life, that when you're 20 years old, you should get married, you should have kids, and you should fall into certain labor roles. But finally, I want to indict their theory of change, because what they do is that they just stand up here and name you a bunch of sitcoms like Kim's Convenience and Modern Family, but that's not really how gay people or black people got change. The way that they got change was through getting a critical mass of people together and demanding for change. If we prove that we had fracturing on our side of the house, apparently a sin. Even if two gay people decide to get married and fall under the traditional customs, it does not change the fact that they're fundamentally gay. It is like all these other structural reasons, which is why that stereotype still exists on their side of the house. But we flipped this claim against them. We told you that straight individuals were likely to feel even more threatened when gay individuals were pursuing things like nuclear family on their side of the house. Those are two independent reasons as to why straight individuals are likely to retaliate rather than buy into these kinds of things. So on their side of the house, they wanted to support and try to get an immovable front buy-in. Our argument was far more reasonable, that there were people that were part of the LGBTQ plus movement in the status quo, and those are the kind of people that we need to get buy-in from. We told you that you would lose buy-in because the vast majority of gay people rejected ideas like the nuclear family. Why did they do this? Because it was their parents that were trying to confine them and their sexual freedom, telling you that you had to marry a woman or you had to marry a man. There was a deep set of trauma that gay people felt because they were confined through generations and generations to fall into these ideas like nuclear families. So when the only protection that you had, which was the LGBT community and the movement, started reinforcing that idea, you were likely to fracture, you were likely to fragment. We also told you that this would lead to high levels of backlash and it would trade off for more immediate needs like getting more workplace stability. I want to forward another extension as to why they get less support on their side of the house, and it's because they decrease solidarity and cooperation with other movements. Note that right now the LGBTQ plus movement is able to cooperate with other progressive movements like the feminist movement and more younger left-wing movements. The problem with the nuclear family is that it directly contradicts the aims of those movements. For example, in the feminist movement, they're trying to get rid of the oppressive labor roles that are endemic in nuclear families, that women have to be the provider for children and that men are the breadwinners. It was oppositional, young, ambitious people because they didn't want to settle down and throw away their career. This was a massive impact because they got less financial support on their side of the house and they got less political support. These young individuals and feminists were less likely to show up for political rallies, less likely to lobby, which means that you not only lost LGBTQ plus people, you also lost massive levels of support from other individuals. At that point, I think we've proved why the movement is significantly weaker on their side of the house. And the weighing here was clear. You never got change in terms of marriage. You never got change in terms of adoption if you didn't get buy-in. Buy-in was an a priori concern to every other impact in this debate. They never got access to their arguments if they did not have a strong movement. The second thing I want to talk about is about individual choice. Go ahead.
Do you oppose the queer community's greatest political success of legalizing queer marriage, since there are polyamorous people on your side as well?
We would argue that if that comes at the cost of trading off with more immediate needs that people have, then sure, we oppose it. But on our side of the house, we think that we get better movements and stronger movements, which means we still accomplish the very same aims that you talk about. The second thing I want to talk about is individual choice. And I want to note the volume of material that Sungju gave you that was just never engaged with their side of the house. We told you there were polyamorous people and there were asexual people that were structurally alienated alienated, that you limited the exploration of identities, and you prevented people from exploring on their side of the house, which is a keystone experience in the LGBTQ plus community. That it was simply very, very expensive to do things like raise a child and enter a marriage. And there are two impacts of this. First of all, you vilified people that weren't able to do things like access marriage. And second of all, you forced people that didn't initially want to get into marriage to do it, which means that for a long period of their lifetime, they would be very, very unhappy. Panel, I want to note that marriages are something that are inherently coercive. It is very, very hard to break out of a marriage, to do things like split assets. There's massive societal and reputational harms. So what do you do on their side of the house? You not only destroy the movement, but you reduce the quality of life of individuals. All of their argument is that like people deserve a choice to pursue things like marriage. We would argue that number one, this is contingent on people having the resources and the capacity to do so. But second of all, there's other mechanisms of fulfilling long-term marriages. Even if we don't support nuclear families on our side of the house, we're still fine with people having things like children, having things like families, having things like houses. I want to note that in this debate, the most important thing was buy-in, and when you fractured the most important thing, which was support from the LGBTQ plus community, you never got buy-in, you never got success. Thank you.
I thank the second opposition for that very fine speech, and now invite the third prompt and the constructive case for side opposition. Here.
The problem with Team USA was their misplaced ideological rigor at the expense of individuals who desired a family of their own. I want to draw attention to how all of their harms are premised upon the movement embracing the current iteration and version of what it means to be a nuclear family. They never explain why this is the permanent version of which the nuclear family ought to be, which is why our material from first and second still stands strongly in the round. But it's precisely through the mechanism of embracing it is where we can change the narratives of what it means to be someone who enters a nuclear family, to say that it can be a queer couple instead of someone who's solely straight doing it. That there are multiple ways to raise a child rather than just a mom and dad on their own, and this is precisely how you open up the change. So while on their side, their burden is to defend why, we should never touch the idea of what a nuclear family is. It's something we should permanently stray away from, because even trying to enter the discourse means we're legitimizing it, means we're conceding to it something that's important. But they don't realize that you are operating in a framework and a world where the glorification of the nuclear family unit exists symmetrically. The question you need to ask yourself is, where do you get to change it so that it's within your interest? Two strategic observations. First, I want to deconstruct the logic and pathway to victory of USA's case. Their model of parent promoting free choice cannot work. Why? Because if their claim is that the nuclear family is so intrinsically harmful, then you would have to actively discourage the nuclear family from happening by demonizing it, by saying that it's going to be bad for you. The reason for this is because, as they say, there are some pressures to trend towards it. So if you say it's free choice, they're more likely to trend towards it when there's free choice. So you have to add a countervailing narrative to say this is bad and that's something that's harmful. That's why their case is incredibly soft-line, because they still refuse to take a trade-off after two speeches. Secondly, I want to note their side sets an impossible burden for themselves. It was created by straight people, so we should oppose it. History was shaped by straight people. If you want to oppose every single heteronormative ideal, then queer movements can't ever embrace anything. I think it's insulting for them to say these are two irreconcilable values when we say that these are just things that are human and you can instead do it. We actually proved the flip. That it's actually incredibly empowering for queer people to reclaim this ideal as something we can have for ourselves rather than them permanently letting the elite straight people concentrate it within their own. Second, I want to clarify what the act of embracing means, because they assert it means forcing everyone into it. Our burden was never to get sweeping legislative changes overnight, but the reason why embracing it was necessary and why free choice was insufficient was because the movement historically said, and per their analysis says, this is something that's bad for you. So the only way to get that free choice and neutralize it is by saying this is an option which you can opt into instead, so we are opening up choice for them. And the parallel of this is simple. Supporting legalization of marriage doesn't mean all queer people are going to be pushed into becoming legally married, right? It's just a choice that's open and available for you. That's the thing you never engage with. They will oppose everything under their side. Two issues in the speech. First, on having narratives of choice, why we're able to neutralize it. Second, on creating access for queer families. First, on the narrative. What we explained was that the nuclear family was a universal symbol of love, loyalty, and sustenance that extended beyond national and cultural lines, which is why it was such a powerful platform to campaign on in places like Ireland, where family is explicitly enshrined as something the Constitution ought to protect. And it was this framework to which you could operate to say that this is something, in comparison to other values in society, which they may value, it's something that we precisely can co-opt because it's in line with what it means to be a human, and you can't necessarily bring this into the queer movement. I think First Op claims that it polarizes homophobic people doesn't stand. What we explained was that it humanizes them. And the reason why it's like to trend towards acceptance rather than rejection is they don't give any reason why queer people are going to be, like homophobic people are more opposed to queer people rather than queer people being in a family. What I'm saying is that because they believe in the idea of a family per their own analysis, entering the family unit is what lets them see you as human individuals. Why is dispelling such narratives so important? Because first, it's what holds the community back from attaining social acceptance. You may see them as capable people, but you never see them as truly another human being unless you're able to have this. Maybe there are other grounds to which you can get acceptance, but we explain why engaging on the specific issue of family unit is important. Their contention is that parallel movements oppose the family unit. This is untrue. The conception of a nuclear family has evolved to be inclusive of things like interracial marriage and adopted kids, and this deals with the extension in second opposition. It's all contingent on this. They don't prove it, which means the burden they've yet to prove is why are these values so bad that they can never ever reconcile. And it was specifically in developing countries where the nuclear family was important that we had to get this, and it's going to be good. Let's do the weighing on coercion. Let's take our best case. On our side, some people are nudged towards opting into the nuclear family. On their side, some people are nudged away from the nuclear family. How do you resolve the deadlock? The first is that there are other barriers that make people reconsider having children. The time and monetary constraints of a nuclear family is what gave rise to countervailing narratives like don't have a child if you can't afford him, or be prepared for 18 years of parental duties, which neutralizes the push to have children. In comparison, it's easier to coerce someone out of having children because there's no tangible, visible cost yet to say you are a bad queer person if you don't align with the values of not having children. That's why there's more coercion on their side because it's easier to bully someone out of it, which is why we promote choice. But secondly, the problems with a nuclear family can be largely mitigated through community support for queer families or work-life balance legislation. But the harms of the lesbian woman who logged her whole life to raise a child but now cannot do so is exclusive to their side because they can never have a child, and that's why having a child is adherent to the nuclear family. On exclusivity of harm, we win. That's the distinction. That's why their side is far worse for choice. Let's go.
Their only mechanism for change are TV sitcoms. If you see gayness as sin, and you see a gay family on TV, you are more likely to view that as the conglomeration of sin than seeing gay people as handy-dandy.
There's an insane demonstration of their inability to listen to our case. What we said from first was that if you agree there's a concentration of resources about how you're better able to push for these things, means that you're not necessarily saying you have to opt into it, but the creation of the platforms and policies that you have is what pushes people towards them. And this issue takes some of their best on the second thing of creating access for queer families. Even if you could dismantle the idea of a nuclear family, the question was whether you should. Because the narrative that queer people are compatible with the nuclear family unit is precisely what lets you advocate for the support structures that enable them to safely start families, like IVF or adoption centers. I think it's the prerequisite to opening up choice, which responds to their 7th minute on opt about why it's hard to have a child. I'm saying that embracing free choice and embracing the nuclear family is what creates the platform for you to want to have that child. And this is important because if you agree that these people are going to otherwise suffer, they really want to have a child because it's so important for their self-actualization, we create the pathway for them to get to that point, and it doesn't exist on their side. Their only response is, this trades away resources from other predictions. This is just ridiculous. So we should just defund all queer art because it's seen as less valuable. We should abandon protests to have trans people in the military because it only affects a small group of people. What we explain is it's an important issue. They should put resources into it, even if there are other considerations they should make. That is just non-comparative. Secondly, we explain it's actually easier to campaign for family support because family is glorified, because it's seen as intersectional with other movements like supporting Planned Parenthood welfare. It becomes mainly easier for us to get these legislative protections on our side or the forms of social acceptance that is on their side. So at the end of this clash, they don't actually have any exclusive harm or benefits in this debate. Our third substantive expands on this excellently by explaining that Even if it wasn't direct material alleviation, it was through media representation that empowers queer people. Within pop culture, we pivot away from homogenized portrayals of queer people in movies as like the eccentric character or someone who's the Mary Sue, by showing that while within these families, there are someone who's core, someone that can be livable, and someone which you are humanized with. At the end of this debate, we proved two very simple things that means we make it to the finals. First, we're able to explain why these parents are better able to have those children there, but two, why these people are able to get rid of the worst stereotypes that currently hold down the queer community. It's only on proposition you enable this change.
Thank the speaker for a very fine speech, and now to end the constructive section of the debate, may we have the third option.
Honestly, Team USA was disappointed when Team Malaysia decided that this debate would be about we have to defend gay people never have families, and they get to defend that they always have access to families. I want to start this speech by really stepping into reality and talking about what this debate is actually about. Their side of the house needed to prove to you an overvailing narrative that told people nuclear families were something you ought to have, something that we should idolize, something that spurred all the change they wanted on their side of the house. Let's be very reasonable, panel. Our side never needed to defend that these people could not have families. They themselves characterized you in first that in a vast majority of cases, people could already have families when they chose to, that marriage laws across the world made it so that people could access these familial units. What then was the difference between the two sides? Because Team Malaysia, you guys getting up here for the entirety of the debate and trying to say we don't support families was not sufficient argumentation. The reality was this. Our world is one in which you got advocacy for immediate needs, that you still had things like access to gay marriage, but you got support for the choices of LGBTQ people. Their side of the house had to defend an adoption of the norm, a norm that a nuclear family was viable. The second thing I want to do just at the top of this speech is point out a contradiction. Last speaker says we didn't have to support the nuclear family narrative as it exists today, or the specific iteration of it. But then they go on to say about why this narrative is such a good thing. Guys, if you think the nuclear family narrative is so problematic, then why are you supporting it on your side? Presumably you would also rather support a world where people had the agency to commit free choice, that we supported things like people's liberation and didn't antagonize people for settling down. On this proposition, which is very uncharitable in this debate and didn't actually engage with the Tuke imperative. I want to ask two questions then in this speech. Number one, who gets support for the LGBTQ plus movement? And second, who actually got better outcomes in this debate? First question then is on who gets support for the LGBTQ movement. I want to first talk about this in terms of stakeholders. Proposition banks most of their case on people who want children, people who actively want to have a family on their side of the house. I have a couple of things to say. Number one, I think you can use their own framing and characterization in the round against them in this regard. That if most people accepted that people should be together, the choice did exist where they wanted it to. So this applied in the most socially progressive societies, and you did get access to a nuclear family if you wanted to opt into it. This is very, very clear. But second, our arguments operated in the vast majority of societies where support was not stringent, where people did not like the idea of people existing in families. And to this we forwarded many arguments. Team Malaysia just keeps saying that we need to defend people who don't have families, but they actually didn't engage with any of our arguments. The first push we heard was on fractionalization, that when you were induced to the idea of a nuclear family, and when this is something the movement necessarily pushed for, the adoption came with a trade-off. In order for the LGBTQ movement to substantially push for change and to encourage people that this idea of a nuclear family was good, it came at the expense of ideas like liberation. It came at the expense of the idea that you could spend the rest of your life or take the first dozen years of your life to figure out who you are. You could explore your sexual identity. The idea of a nuclear family was diametrically opposed to these things. They could not just get up here and say, we get this too on their side of the house, because the adoption of a norm, what this looked like when people were giving speeches about about having a nuclear family and how it was so good to be a gay person and a familial unit.
Right.
All of those things necessarily came with a trade-off, and that alienated people. In movements all across the world where support for LGBTQ people was already in the vast minority, you needed the person who is asexual or didn't have romantic preferences to buy into your movement, because then you galvanized collective change that uplifted everyone. This was the much more reasonable comparative, and it's way too late for Proposition Reply to actually respond to the arguments you heard in the round. But second, we told you about how this is likely to immediately alienate people. That, look, the wash in this debate was societies where we already had this acceptance, but the change then was then you threatened one thing that people felt was closest, that the idea of the nuclear family was so enshrined in conservatism, which they concede to you themselves, and that necessarily meant that people felt aggravated and threatened when you also tried to adopt this idea of a nuclear family, that they felt threatened and were not likely to open reforms that they immediately shut down. They hated the idea that people were overstepping on the nuclear family that they believed righteously belonged to them. So all of this meant that their arguments in this round were applicable to the vast minority of people, the places where nuclear families and the choice already exist, but our arguments catered to the vast majority. It is way too late again for Proposition Reply to come to this. The last piece of material then I want to forward to you is this idea of elitism. They try to say that, we make things less expensive on our side of the house, but this is not really the reason why things like IVF were so expensive. It was because companies knew it was an inelastic good and that people would pay anything to have access to those things, and they were able to use this monopoly power to create high prices. Their side of the house, maybe if they get a little bit more support of that, is knifed by the fractionalization that occurs when they feel like the only way for the LGBTQ movement to go forward is to regress, because they concede this. The nuclear family is an outdated idea of how society runs, so why on earth, Proposition, would you insist that everyone go to revert to it? I have no idea. Before I talk about the second clash on better outcomes,
If conservatives are so uncompromising and will antagonize every deviation from the patriarchal nuclear family, how does a queer couple in an area where queer marriage is legalized opt into a family?
I think that on your side of the house, you get more antagonization. I just explained to you that people feel like the thing they value the most, the nuclear family, is being stripped of them to begin with. This is why you preferred our counterfactual, where we did not set the bar as so high as to try and take a nuclear family, but push for gradualism, that you could still get access to things like equality in the workplace for LGBTQ people, but you did not need to insist on this primary doctrine that dictated the language and the rhetoric of the movement on your side of the house. Who then gets better outcomes? I want to talk about a crucial stakeholder in this debate that I think they just brush over. The idea that not all members of the LGBTQ community bought into this idea of the nuclear family. Their only response to this is to say, but when we advocated for equality and gay marriage, those people didn't necessarily feel alienated. But our response is quite simple. The act of embracement was a question of the lifestyle of those individuals and insisted that there was only one way you ought to live and one presiding paradigm. It was not about choice. This was different from things like marriage. It was about the only way you ought to live your life is this very specific prescription on their side of the house. It was antagonistic to things like liberalization, whereas existing in some sort of marriage was not. This was the difference on our side of the house. This meant then you got more alienation of those groups and you got less propensity for change. But secondly, we think you got less solidarity with things for other movements. In response to a POI we give in their first, they say, the feminist movement embraces nuclear families. Guys, that's just not true. Feminism and fourth wave feminism today is diametrically opposed to those ideas. So in this regard, we think it was a reversion of norms for the LGBTQ community to go back to adopt a nuclear family when their other sister movements were harming it, which meant you got less buy-in from constituent and neighboring social movements on our side of the house, and you got less ability, rather, to mobilize the change you so needed. There was a trade-off in this debate, but Proposition just wanted to try and back us into a corner and say people did not need to have families. Guys, it's so clearly unreasonable. The real change in this debate then was, if it was true, you got sweeping policy changes on their side of the house, which we explained to you are unlikely to change, then presumably this narrative had some coercive application to begin with. Presumably it told people that there is one way you ought to live your life. The strategic mistake of Team Malaysia was to keep capitalizing on a narrative that was unreasonable and untrue. We were true to the heart of the motion, that if it was true they wanted their benefits, they needed to take a hard stance. We took the hard stance in this debate, embracing a nuclear family ideal which was outdated, ahistoric, and harmed all individuals in the movement. That was directly antagonistic to the progressive movement of the LGBTQ movement, was going to yield harm for all. It is a clear opposition ballot.
prize speakers, may we first have the awful prize speaker to deliver a speech not exceeding 4 minutes and 15 seconds.
Alright, is everyone good? Side proposition's entire case is based on a logical jump. And that jump is that when the queer community embraces nuclear family, that they'll get access to the institutions of a nuclear family. They'll access things like cheaper IVF and things like adoption. This is not a logical jump that I think you as a panel should let them run away with. Because in order for them to get all their practical benefits, they had to prove that governments and society at large would change. And it's because they haven't proved that, and they haven't answered our 5, 6 different mechanisms of analysis as to how they don't get that, why they lose the debate. 2 key clashes. The first clash is about buy-in. This is the most important clash in the round. And I want to talk about 3 stakeholders under buy-in. The first stakeholder are people that are conservative or generally in the status quo don't like gay people. I want to know, this is the only stakeholder that they get a delta of change on their side of the house. We told you that conservatives were unlikely to budge. They had fundamental religious and ideological objections to the existence of gay people. And no matter how many times they watched Kim's Convenience or Modern Family, it would not change these deep-rooted beliefs that were ingrained and indoctrinated in them and perpetuated through societies for decades and decades. But we also gave you other reasons that weren't properly engaged with from side proposition. That there was a level of competition of resource that existed between getting things like adoption and getting things like tax incentives, and that if more gay people were accessing things like nuclear families, it would take you out. We also told you that marriage and adoption are viewed as being something that are sanctious and sanctioned by religions. And when people enter those kind of fields, again, people were likely to feel threatened. There are 2 takeaways you have. Number 1, they don't get those people jumping to the side of supporting LGBTQ plus movements. And number 2, you're more likely to have retaliation and backlash. What were the 2 stakeholders that we told you about that didn't get proper engagement? First of all, was people that were inside of the LGBTQ plus community themselves. And we gave you structural reasons why most of these people did not want this idea of a nuclear marriage. That for years and years, they were repressed by their parents that were telling them that you need to settle down with a good boy or a good girl and bring me kids. The people that were in the LGBTQ plus movement were trying to escape that narrative and escape that societal repression. And what they did on their side of the house is that you made the movement adopt that societal repression. That was likely to be very, very divisive. The most fundamental core of the LGBTQ plus movement was likely to leave. But the final mechanism were people that were outside of the movement. These people were likely to be incredibly progressive because that allows them to align with the LGBTQ plus movement. And we told you that the nuclear family ideal was sexist and patriarchal, that it was oppositional to things like the feminist movement, that in the 4th wave advocated for the liberation of women and the accessing of things like career opportunities. And you needed external actors because the bottom line is that in most countries, the gay community was very, very small and they relied on the support of buy-in of external stakeholders to get policy and change. This outweighed their case on 2 levels. First of all, is on a prerequisite. They never got broad-based supports for marriage if they never got buy-in from their own community. But second of all was on severity, that the more immediate needs that gay people face, like workplace harassment, like hate crimes, never get addressed, and those things were going to lead to more tangible change than not getting a marriage. The second thing I want to talk about is how this harms individuals. And my opponents already concede that this was likely to be a coercive norm, that it was going to enter things like media, and it was likely going to be the priority for things like financing. And the reason why coercion was so bad was because it prevented people from enjoying their lives. It structurally alienated people that were asexual or pansexual and didn't fit into the strict structures of nuclear families. It limited people's exploration because marriage had very, very high sunk costs, and it prevents you from having the kind of flexibility to explore your identity. This was crucial to the queer experience. And finally, it was just very, very damn expensive to do something like a marriage and raise children. We told you that the nuclear family was never going to adapt. This is a narrative that exists for thousands and thousands of years. This was a narrative that had strict labor roles. The only way that they get access to their arguments about humanization is if they buy into the kind of strict, rigid nuclear family that is so problematic. On buy-in, on individuals, we win. It is a clear opposition ballot. Thank you.
Now to end this fantastic series, may we have the proposition reply speaker.
If watching the most human facets of a queer individual, the most selfless, the most loving aspects of them, couldn't convince homophobes, then putting them into a capitalist system through a system of quota, forcing them to work in workplace quotas, would ultimately result in far worse outcomes under opposition. This debate had to exist in a world where the queer community had some power, not just that on our side of the house, queer community was utterly demonized, and on their side, they're going to institute strict workplace quota for workplace integration, and somehow they will succeed. Two things in this speech. Firstly, on the diversity of the queer community, and therefore we are coercive, says opposition. Two responses. One, all of their analysis on settling down, on marriages being hard to escape from preventing sexual freedom or whatever, are all contingent on marriage, not on a nuclear family. Insofar as the queer movement has historically supported queer marriage, opposition can't run away by saying, you know what, we don't actually care. But the response to the POI in third is damning, because they will only oppose the sweeping reforms, like marriage, if the legalization of queer marriage comes at the expense of other policies, which means it's not about the immediate inclusion of people within the community, it's about objective legislative outcomes. Then all we have to prove is that we can legalize IVF and have anti-discrimination bills, and that is a concession that the coerciveness of the movement does not matter and is irrelevant to this debate. But secondly, the misunderstanding of our case runs rampant throughout their bench, a misunderstanding of what policies encompass. Opposition reply says that doesn't mean you get access to systems of nuclear family. That's literally our first argument about giving you access to the system of nuclear family. Then third opposition says it's going to be coercive because there are policies. Policies are not inherently coercive. We told you about policies that empower choice in a society that was coercive. No response. Two things then. Firstly, on harming politically advocacy. I think this entire issue is contingent on how people are going to react to the queer nuclear family, and their case of change also relies upon some degree of humanization. Insofar as we prove that our humanization is the most effective, that is how you're able to overcome stereotypes. You only believe it's a sin because you believe that queer individuals have horrible morals. But when you see them loving and caring for the child, then it gets rid of the stereotype that they are selfish, that they don't care. Three things. One, about backlash. How do you think any movement ever got any change? If people were so homophobic, does opposition really believe that the moment you say let's have queer marriage, thereby encroaching on the sanctity of marriage, people were like, oh, that's fine, at least you don't touch the children, right? Our mechanism for critical mass, in fact, was threefold. One, we told you about platforming successful stories that on opposition would not exist because we told you about structures that never existed. Secondly, because of shaping parental perceptions. Like the feminist movement, they were not opposed to family because they empowered motherhood. They were opposed to the patriarchal norms of nuclear family. We can then be opposed to the homophobic norms of patriarchal family, and that is how families evolve over time. That is the reason why women are allowed to work and still have families, because things are allowed to evolve. But thirdly, on shared history. Historically, children are the very thing that connects all individuals. When it comes to the love is free, it is about making common ground that opposition eviscerates. Secondly, we think the humanization on our side is unique because we equate the labor of love for parenting with queer individuals, with a framework that straight individuals are familiar with. What opposition has to defend is a world that never touches the idea of a nuclear family. By embracing it, we are able to show alternative mechanisms of somebody who could still love their children. The impact is simple. It's not just IVF, it is about stopping the demonization of queer families who are told by the movement that they are conforming to heteronormativity and are not allowed to access families. What oppression symmetrically exists perhaps, but the most urgent issue is homophobia, and opposition can't make an arbitrary distinction on what they believe to be more important. Price is of no issue for somebody who wants to have a child. Opposition doesn't get to decide that. Under a system of homophobia, any choice is liberation, and perhaps the ballot then is clearer for proposition.
Thank you to both teams for what was excellent for semis. If everyone can kindly leave this room now, we will get doing what we were brought here to do.